Mm. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna let my thing being recorded, and then I'm also going to
See if I can shift this so you have less of a view of my treadmill.
Girl, we all have it now. it's yeah. It's been a hard year.
It's been a challenge.
Yeah, we all either wish we had it on our background or we just yeah. Cancel, and I'm going to okay, so my iPad is recording it, and I'm gonna give a very flattering view of my ceiling, so let me put that out. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I think everything is set. Okay, I'm very excited. Yeah, should I call you Eugenia or
You can call me Gina, which is
Gina?
what my friends call me. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So like, would you like to give like a quick introduction of yourself, like where you are, what 2021 has been for you until now?
Yeah, I can do that. So my name is Gina Zuroski, and I am a professor of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario. And I live in Hamilton, so I've spent the lockdown year in my attic office in my house in central Hamilton. Hamilton is on the traditional territories of the Mississauga Nation and the Haudenosaunee people, and it's an area known by treaty as the dish with one spoon. So I sit, I live in the dish. And the dish with one spoon wampum agreement is an agreement made between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples to preserve the resources of the land, to and live in a way in which the resources would be shared peaceably. So the spoon is in distinction to the knife, so not to compete for resources, but to coexist peacefully and share them. And so I've been thinking a lot this year about the ways in which the dish has not been respected on those terms by the history of colonization in this area, which is, part of the reason that I'm here. So that's one thing I've been thinking about a lot during our pandemic year. I'm originally from Rochester, New York. I grew up in Rochester. My mother is Chinese American. Her parents, my grandparents, moved to New York City from Beijing and Shanghai, respectively, during World War II, and then raised their kids, my mom and her two sisters, in Jamaica, Queens. And my dad is Polish, Italian American from Western New York. So I grew up in Western New York in Rochester, and I attended Columbia College as an undergrad. I started in fall 1994. I was 17 years old. I was super thrilled to be moving to New York City all on my own.
I know. I remember what that feeling is like.
Yeah, it was just like, I mean, in retrospect, like, it's astonishing to me that my parents let me do it.
I know. At 17, you're just like, yep, Now
Yeah.
you're on your own.
Yeah, I had no idea what I was doing, and I was and it was a different time, like I remember I started smoking cigarettes. You could buy a pack of Camel Lights for $2.25 at like the bodega. um I knew which bars in the East Village, wouldn't card even an extremely young looking 17-year-old.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. We've all got a list.
Yeah. So it was a really exciting time for me.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say, which might kind of segue into our conversation, is that I always knew I wanted to be an English major. I really, really loved English literature, or literature in English. I was a voracious reader. I wanted to be a poet, actually. I didn't think I was going to become an English professor right away, but I wrote poetry. And so I took a ton of English classes, but I didn't know anything about ethnic studies. I knew that I was, when I was growing up, we said we were half Chinese, or half Chinese, half white.
Right.
And so I grew up with an understanding of like my cultural heritage or my multiple cultural heritages, but I'd never heard the term Asian American. I don't think that was a term that we used in my family to describe who we were. Um, and so I really, the ethnic studies protests were really important for me because it was kind of an education in like what ethnicity was and what the politics of ethnicity and race were, that I had never had before.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's very surprising because, like, yeah, but like when I'm like doing research, like I suddenly realized that like the term Asian American or like even like the term like Latinx has not been, like on the paper. So everyone's, coming up with different words, different, ideas. So yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely, I definitely feel that. Yeah, so like, okay, so you're a 17-year-old in New York City, and then you're a poet. I would love to read some of your poetry or your work anytime, but
Okay, I
yeah,
can send you
yeah,
some.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. But how like so what was your first like exposure to, this protest? Like when was it? How did it happen?
Yeah. So it was my sophomore year. It was the second half of my sophomore year at Columbia. And I remember I remember it started with the 4 PhD students who went on hunger strike,
Right.
after the administration refused to, have a conversation about beginning a program.
Mm-hmm.
And they set up like a camp in the middle of campus. And so it was getting a lot of attention, so we saw them every day, when we were, going to class and things. And I remember that they also, there was a, like a kind of a movement, they put signs and posters all around campus. So in many of the classrooms, I remember I remember distinctly, they had signs that said things like, 0 courses in Asian American history offered at Columbia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember being really confused because I knew that there were courses in Asian history, right? And one of the signs I think said something like, zero classes offered at Columbia in, like the last 10 years in Chinese American art and culture or something like that. And I was really confused because just the semester before I had taken a class in Chinese art. So that was kind of where I was, where I didn't even really understand the distinction between Chinese and Chinese American or Asian and Asian American. And I didn't understand the specificity of saying Asian American culture, or Chinese American culture. So those were like the first moments that I remember really kind of tuning in and trying to figure out what this protest was for.
Right,
Um,
absolutely.
And then it escalated, and you could feel it on campus. So it escalated, in a group of like a larger group of students, I think led by undergrads who were supporting the graduate students who had started it, took over Low Library. And campus security like arrested a bunch of those students. So I'm not really sure what that means. I remember that's what we were talking about, right? Like the campus cops have started arresting the
Arresting
ethnic
people.
studies
Mhm.
protesters. And so and so at that point, that mobilized more attention. So I joined the protest with a bunch of other students, both undergraduate and graduate. um, After the Low Library takeover, there was a movement to occupy Hamilton Hall.
Mm.
And Hamilton Hall, I assume it's the same now. I mean, Hamilton Hall was where I took Lit Hum, and
Absolutely. Yeah. The six floor walk, the crazy
yeah,
elevators. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, and the dean of the college was in there too, right?
Right. Right.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, and as I mentioned in my email, funny enough, so the dean of Columbia College at that time was Dean Catherine Yatrakis, and
Mhm.
I had dated her son my freshman year because we lived on the same floor of John Jay. So like I knew her personally.
Uh-huh.
We weren't close, especially since I'd broken up with her nephew,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. But
but yeah.
yeah, yeah, you knew her like more than like, like Dean somewhere, off on campus.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't really remember very clearly how many days the Hamilton Hall takeover was. I do remember that I spent at least one night in there. So it was an overnight takeover. We had been warned, like the campus cops had come and told us that we needed to clear out and the building was closed. And we refused. And spent the night, sleeping on the floor in there. And then in the middle of the night, campus security came in with like these giant like video cameras. They looked like a TV crew, and
Yeah.
flashlights, and they were like flashing. And I remember some of the more experienced activists were like,
Uh-huh.
cover your faces, they're trying to ID you. So we were all like, ah. But they didn't kick us out. They filmed us and they did a wide sweep, and then they left. And the next morning was when that picture that's in the Spectator was taken. So we linked arms to bar the dean of the college and several other administrators from entering their offices.
Mhm.
And and Dean Yatrakis like came right up to me, and she knew who I was, and she was like, Gina Zuroski. I was
Oh.
like, ethnic studies. So yeah, but in addition to kind of locking down the building, most of the activity over what I think must have been several days was rallying outside. And so we were passing out flyers explaining, what ethnic studies was. There
Mhm.
was there was a kind of megaphone that was being passed around, and people just took turns kind of speaking to why they were at the protest and what they hoped to accomplish. Um, there was a lot of a lot of students who did not agree with the position that we were taking would come, and like campus Republicans like came and like tried to get all punchy with us. And so there were
Oh.
some interesting like back and forths between, again, like the more experienced activists who kind of knew what they were doing and knew what they were saying. And I remember thinking that I remember being a little scared that I was going to be responsible for, explaining things, because I was so new to what we were doing. I didn't have my mind or my vocabulary,
Mhm. Mhm.
firmly wrapped around the issue. I was really learning on the ground. I also remember one last detail that made a huge impact on me. They the university closed the gates at 116th Street,
Main gate.
at both ends, so at Amsterdam and on Broadway.
Mm.
And it was the first time since I had arrived there that I'd ever seen them close those gates. Like, it hadn't really occurred to me that you could actually close and lock those gates. And they had campus cops, and I think possibly even New York, like NYPD, stationed at the gates, and they were checking student IDs. So they were only allowing Columbia students and Barnard students with ID onto campus. And I like that made an enormous impression on me, because it was the first time I understood with some kind of clarity the way that Columbia understood its relationship to the community of Harlem and Morningside Heights that we were in. You know, it was really clear that they were trying to keep people of color from the community off campus.
Absolutely.
And like the rhetoric that white students were using about the necessity of like staying safe and what safety meant for them, and the way that that safety was racialized, was really it was really eye-opening.
Oh, definitely. And especially because this was, this was a protest about Columbia, like, like not even like the whole Columbia University. It was about like an undergraduate like program and like a graduate program. It was like all about like academic policy. And to have like, yeah, to like bar, like only let students in, definitely that's very eye-opening. I did not know this, but this is definitely something I need to unpack.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Like, so like, yeah, and like I've been through like the whole like COVID pandemic situation. I know that they like closed down the side gates, but like the main gates have never ever been closed down. Like in my 4 or 5 years of like time in New York City, that has never happened. So yeah, that's definitely like, yeah, like
Yeah, it was
yeah,
wild.
yeah, definitely wild. They definitely got it in their heads somehow. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, like well, how did you, I guess like what was the protest? So like I feel that, there were some experienced activists and then more, it's exactly what, like protests look like, like more newcomers sort of like join and you get like educated and you get like, vamped up on the spot. Like, but how did the like protest group sort of like respond as everything sort of like proceeded on and like the main gates were closed down and stuff like that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, in terms of what the protesters were demanding, that was an interesting trajectory. So I'm pretty sure, although I'm not 100% certain, that the original four graduate students who were on hunger strike, I think that the terms of their strike was that they were going to strike until the university agreed to create a department
Mhm,
of of ethnic studies.
mhm,
So part of what I learned in all of this, it was also my first education in like the structure of a university. You know, the difference between a department and a program, the difference between a program with faculty, dedicated faculty hires, and a program without one. You know, it's like I didn't know any of that stuff as a sophomore.
mhm.
but
Absolutely.
but you learned really fast as you were trying to keep up with like what is it we're asking for.
Mhm,
So I think one of the things that had happened during the first phases of the protest were um, the university, or some, you know, I don't know if it was the college, some part of the university administration had responded to the protesters by saying that there was no need for an ethnic studies department or program, because it fell under the heading of American studies, and there was already an American studies program. So a lot of the discussion during the phase of the protest that I was involved in was responding to the idea that ethnic studies could be contained within American studies.
mhm.
Um, and that's where I learned the word hegemonic for the first time. I remember like
Mm.
on the flyers we were handing out, there was a whole piece about how the difference between an ethnic studies program and the existing American studies program at Columbia was that ethnic studies was used a non-hegemonic framework that foregrounded race and the analysis of race in its understanding of American cultural politics, whereas the American Studies program had a hegemonic understanding of, history and all of this stuff. And so that was like the main thing was the specificity of ethnic studies as a methodology and a field, a political field of study. And the importance of a department, because a department would come with resources and primarily resources to make tenure track hires. And we didn't get that. Like, I think it's kind of, I don't know, it's significant that from the perspective of those of us involved in the protest, it really felt like a failure because we didn't get any of that. I remember, I think what happened in the end was the university agreed to create like maybe you can tell me, it was like a program, but it was just like a line, right? Like there was an Asian American studies line and an African American studies line.
Yes, yes. Basically, like I know that they sort of like agreed to sit down and talk about it, and then yeah. But even until now, it's not like we still don't have a department. We're still like a center, and that's like not like And I also found out about it like talking to like the administrators there, and just like there's like a center, there's like an institute, there's like a department, there's like million different phases in between, and yeah.
And there's a material aspect to it, which are the resources, and then there's also the matter of institutional recognition. The demand for a department was a demand that the university kind of recognize the importance, not just the legitimacy, but the importance of the field of ethnic studies, and their like stalwart refusal to even consider it spoke volumes about but that was also important for me to understand. Like at the time, it was just disappointing and actually a little bit confusing because it was so clear how much ethnic studies was a thing, like how widely recognized it was, how important it was to entire like programs like the California system. So I was a little confused about why Columbia and the other Ivy League schools. So a bunch of delegates from ethnic studies protesters at other schools, like on the Eastern Seaboard, came and joined us while we were doing the Hamilton Hall takeover. And that was great. So I knew that this was something that was coming up at all of these like top schools.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't until much later, in my career, when I was older and wiser about all of this stuff, that I understood the specific threat that an ethnic studies, a critical race, that the field we were asking for posed to institutions like Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, that these were institutions that were founded quite explicitly on principles of white supremacy, and that they just were not prepared. They were not prepared to make any space within them for work that really questioned those very fundamental values. And I get that now in a way that I did not at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like you were talking about, that reminds me of like so the vice president, I think he was David Cohen, like he issued these like statements saying like, oh, like, forming courses or departments shouldn't be political. And he used like the word like, oh, like academia should be apolitical. But then, then like students were all like, but this whole university, the whole core, everything is like built on a fundamentally political system of like white supremacy and American hegemony that just like trying to go against this like is in a way like even returning to at least like a facade of apolitical. So yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really just like, yeah, and it's so surprising how like you know you sort of like joined in because like of these like, oh, we don't zero courses on like Chinese American like culture, or like zero courses on Asian American culture, and like you were like the dynamics flew so that you were like knowledgeable about all of that like while joining in these like protests.
Yeah, yeah. It was like a really concentrated energy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's like, it's like 2 weeks like crash course on white supremacy and Columbia University. Absolutely, absolutely. Like, what do you think made that like dynamic like possible, like that, even that short term, like that energy, how like people are getting educated? Because like when I see certain campus like protests or like movements in, there has been definitely a few, but like I feel that like it isn't as it like takes so many different aspects to for it to like build up that momentum that you guys had. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is I have to give enormous credit to the graduate students that started it all, right? I think sometimes about, it's weird for me now as someone who teaches and mentors graduate students. Um, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that the students who went on hunger strike were young people. They were young people like my own students, who are brilliant and wonderful. But also, huge part of my job, as I understand it, is to prevent things from ever reaching a crisis point where my students or any students are responsible for kind of like carrying the weight of protest, or like I encourage them to learn to protest. I think it's I don't want to shield them from political action, but when I think about those 4 PhD students setting up camp in the middle of campus and going on a hunger strike for, like you said, like an academic ask, like for the creation of a department, because they didn't have a space in the university where they could carry out the research they wanted to do, like they were asking for the establishment of a very particular set and doable set of research conditions.
Mhm, mhm.
And they just seemed like, they seemed so grown up to me as an undergrad watching that happen. I mean, they were astonishing as leaders and as mobile. So, I think that we were all kind of moved by that action. It's
Absolutely.
just stunning to me now to think about how young they were and how much courage it takes to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Like even I'm like, reading about like, what the undergraduate like population and like the graduate population did. And I'm like, I'm reading through these articles and like, man, like what did they teach in, like, I don't know, like 10 years ago that, made them like so courageous and like, have that like grit to like go through it all. And like, and I'm sure like and you also talked about like the campus cops coming in with like video cameras, and you were like sent this like letter from like the dean for like threatening of like academic like like some
Yeah.
sort of punishment. Like wait, how did that impact you? How did that how was that for like an undergraduate sophomore,
Yeah.
you know
I mean, it was a little surreal, but I also think that this is, there's probably some element in here of how many of the students, I mean, certainly not all. I don't want to speak for everyone that was involved, and I definitely would not lump the graduate students in with this. But just speaking for myself and knowing that there were a lot of undergrads at Columbia like me,
Mm.
um, we were a certain group of relatively privileged kids, right? Even those of us who were on scholarship, you know, we're not rich. I mean, there are a lot of rich people. You're at Columbia, you know, right? Like, you know, we weren't necessarily all like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But every one of us had like gotten into Columbia and decided to go. And we were high achievers, you know, we were kids who did well in school, who got good grades, who tended to be on the right side of authority. And I think that's especially true of a lot of the students of color at Columbia, you know, like you don't become part of the racialized minority at a school like Columbia unless you've learned to play by the rules in a certain way, even if only on one level. And for me, it was on all levels. Like I was a really good kid.
Oh.
um,
Mhm.
and so I think part of the courage was like old fashioned, like what's the word, like entitlement, right? Like there was a certain sense where, at least for, again, just speaking for myself, it
Mhm.
was like, this is supposed to be one of the best schools in the world, and my parents and I are making enormous sacrifices for me to come here and get the best education possible. And I just learned that there's a whole area of study that I'm really interested in now that they don't have here, and that's ridiculous, you know? So like, give us that. We were, you know, so we were like good kids and felt entitled to, you know, like the best education. And so yeah, there was a certain amount of just like, this is what we need, so why won't you give it to us? But
Absolutely.
I also think though that well, a couple of things. One is that the response, you know, all of the policing of those protests
Mhm.
that we got in response was also was really eye-opening. You know, I think that for students like me, that was the first time I ever really experienced firsthand how quickly the arm of authority will
Mhm.
come down, you
Yeah.
know,
Mhm.
like pretty severely, um, when students of the kind that were gathering, you know, in that protest start to make demands on the institution. You know, it was really the first time that I saw with clarity that Columbia University was not a benevolent institution. And it particularly was not, I mean, there was a real sense in the response from the university, and especially they're calling like police on us, whether campus cops or NYPD. It was the first time I understood that this university was like allowed us in, but did not consider it like for us, you know,
Absolutely.
that we were not centered in its
Yeah.
understanding
Yeah.
of its own mission.
Mhm.
um and that was important to learn, you know, I mean, that's an ethnic studies lesson right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that letter of censure that I got. So it was like long after the fact. So after the protests were all done, I don't know how they identified me. It could have been because my face ended up on the Spectator's front page. It could be from when they came in with cameras and filmed us. But I got a letter, you know, in my campus mailbox sometime later, informing me that I had been found officially like guilty of,
Guilty.
I don't remember if the word guilty was used, but it might
Uh,
have been, but it was like the official term was I had been censured. So I had been officially censured by the university. There were no immediate consequences attached to my censure, but it meant that if I did anything else, you know, like that out of line, if I broke any other rule of any kind,
mhm.
I don't remember what specified,
Uh,
um, that I could be subject to immediate expulsion from the university.
wow.
And I just thought, again, like I thought this was kind of like laughable. I was like, this is ridiculous. You know,
Uh-huh.
like I am a straight A student, and like,
Absolutely. And you're
like
just
what is
saying
this?
like, yeah, you're just saying like, I want to study in this
Right.
area that you
Like,
guys don't
I had
offer.
more classes to take, but I remember telling my parents,
Mm,
in part because I thought, like, who can take this letter seriously? And they were terrified. They were not angry, but they were so scared that I was going to get kicked out of school.
mm,
So I think part of the courage too was like a lack of fear that came from lack of direct experience
mhm,
at that point. I mean, again, like, there were experienced activists in the mix, and so their courage came, was conditioned kind of differently. But this was 1996. It was before 9/11. It
mm.
was before the wars in the aftermath of 9/11. um it was, a time when, I don't know. I just think that that I didn't have in mind the the expectation of the kinds of, extreme responses that
Absolutely.
political action can invite
Mhm,
at that time.
mhm,
And so it felt safer than it was to participate in a
mhm.
certain way.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I can, yeah, it's yeah, like it would be totally different from like a student of color getting those letters like today and like and yeah, and Colombia definitely has a record of and like what I see that as like sort of like a use of these like vague sense of authority that they have over students to like to send to like like a like an 18, 19-year-old like not even like drinking age person for like yeah and like it's not like okay like like protesters might have like put on some vague artistic like flags on like Hamilton Hall like did a sit-in but like it wasn't like it wasn't anything that like directly threatened like the safety of like any kind of like student body. Like Hamilton Hall is basically just like open 24/7. It's like like you can just go in for like student group meetings and stuff. I remember like going in there for like an 11 p.m. like pizza session with friends. Yeah, so yeah, so just to think about that, just to grapple about with that and like, even like now is completely out of scale.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. It was wild.
I know, but like did your parents like tell you to like, opt out of the protests or something like that?
I don't remember. It's
Mhm.
funny. I don't my parents are like my parents have always been really good liberals. And very my mom's different now, actually. My mom's become a little bit more radicalized, in the 21st century.
Uh-huh.
It was she became she worked at the Horace Mann School, and
Oh.
for years and years and years, she actually took that job my junior year at Columbia. So my parents moved back down to New York
Mhm,
City.
mhm.
Um, and she took a job as the head of their preschool years, because that's her specialty. She worked in early childhood education and development. And so for many, many years, she was the head of their preschool. And then they like created a diversity office, and she was literally the only upper administrator of color in the school. And so they made her the director of diversity. And
Mhm.
she did that for the last 7 years of her career. And that radicalized her, because she was like, this is all major bullshit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, I guess yeah, I guess, like, that year was, like, kind of like the foundational important
Yeah, exactly.
period. So,
But
yeah.
yeah, my parents, I don't remember how much I was communicating with them about the protests while the protests were happening.
Mhm.
I do know that, when I told them, they've always been extremely supportive of me, so it's a little weird when my parents don't support. And actually, I can't think of an example when they've ever actually like
Just, like, said no.
not supported me, right? Like, said, like, we don't support you in this.
Mhm.
um but it's a rare occasion when I feel like ambivalence in their support or uncertainty.
Right.
And I think that this was one of those cases. It's like anytime I've been involved in political actions that they understood might might get me kicked out of an institution that I worked really, really hard to get into,
Yeah, yeah,
they were terrified of that. And they were much more afraid of that than I ever was, because for me, like, the protest is as important as the inclusion, and maybe more important, right? Because, like, I don't know if I want to be included in a place that doesn't respond to these calls for action. But I think they were really worried about me getting kicked out of Columbia. A very similar thing happened when I was in grad school at Brown. So I went straight into grad school at
Mhm,
Brown after graduating from Columbia, to get a PhD in English.
mhm.
And while I was in grad school, I was part of the core group of organizers who tried to unionize the TAs at Brown. And that was a huge case. Like, that was a huge, we mobilized with the UAW, and the university ended up taking our case to the National Labor Relations Board, and we were the case that the Bush appointed NLRB overturned, which got the
Oh,
NYU union, that was the first and only
wow.
private school TA union,
Uh-huh.
rescinded. Like, it was horrible. It was so horrible. And it set back an entire generation of grad school unionizing for, for private schools. Anyway, that too was, I think, maybe the only other instance where I told my parents, like, I'm doing this really important thing. It's so exciting. You want to hear about it? And they were just like, what the fuck?
It's like, ooh,
Yeah,
you
they're
want to
like,
be careful
stop.
with that, yeah. I know, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I think it's important, though. I'm really glad that, I think one major difference between my parents' generation and
Mhm.
my parents as part of their generation
Generation,
and mine
mhm.
is the way that, um, the way that I learned that political activism was a really crucial part of education, that it wasn't at odds with my education, and it wasn't like it wasn't extracurricular. The
Mhm.
political action was actually the site where I was doing a lot of the kind of learning that I actually went to school to try to do. Um, so I'm grateful for that, even though I'm sorry I freaked my parents out.
No, no, you've got to do that once in your life. So, you got two times. So, yeah, that makes you win the parent-daughter game. But
Yeah.
yeah, it really, yeah. I mean, I'm like hearing this and like, okay, so like how did your experience like protesting as an undergraduate in Columbia College, like that must have definitely influenced your like decision to like unionize for like Brown University, right? Like how how
Yeah.
how did that play out?
Yeah, yeah. I think that the ethnic studies protests were really important for me because they did initiate me into a kind of political activism, and as a practice, like as part of my practice,
Yeah.
right? So I think that following that experience, I definitely understood myself as someone who shows up for actions in a way that I didn't learn how to do, and I didn't have opportunities to do when I was younger. I went to a private school in Rochester, New York, and surrounded by rich white people, conservative rich white people, and I just like, yeah, like, activism was not, I wasn't one of those kids who was like, like organizing in the lunchroom,
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um
Yeah. It takes a specific mindset to even like imagine that kind of setting. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I was a nerd, and I was a poet, right? So I would like show up for open mic poetry events and like speech and debate matches. But
Definitely feel that.
um,
Mhm.
so yeah, the ethnic studies protests were really important because it just showed me a whole new form of showing up, and
Absolutely.
what that entails, and what the stakes of it are, and why it's important, and developing that vocabulary, I think, of why it's important. And that did extend into, I brought it with me to grad school, which is absolutely why I was part of the group that, that initiated the union drive. And those were also the years, so I was in grad school during the years when Al Gore lost the election and George W. Bush stole the White House. And I was in grad school on 9/11. I
Oh,
was in grad school during the years when Bush waged war, like used 9/11 as an excuse
right.
to wage a number
War.
of wars. So there were all, I mean, there were so many things to protest. Like it's like every morning you woke up to a whole new like hell world that,
Absolutely. It's like, yep.
yeah. And I had some idea of how to do that. I think that and I managed to get my PhD at the same time. Like I don't really remember how we managed to do it all, but but yeah, I think I was initiated into, this generation of academics for whom activism was not separate
Mhm.
from our scholarly work.
Absolutely.
And I've tried to carry that through, like I think that um, I feel like my own graduate students now are kind of in a similar space. And I think that, historical and political pressures of the moment have something to do with that. But I feel very grateful that I was prepared by my own education, like starting with those ethnic studies protests, to
Mhm.
be someone who can mentor graduate students who are now like trying to learn to do that in
Absolutely.
their own moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is like really meaningful to hear because, you know, when I was like talking to Professor Sandler and like other like advisors on my subject, I was like researching like, oh, maybe I should interview this person. And I was like, going through like bios and just like doing like research on LinkedIn. I was like, it like really, interested me because like these like protesters, these like hunger strikers, like who even had like really like even had like really small involvement in the protest, they all turned out in diversity programs, teaching, like even our professor like Marcel Agreros, who who were one of the hunger strikers. He ended up teaching astrology at Columbia, but he's still part of the program, the initiative, the diversity initiative, and he still has like half of his foot like in there. So it's so interesting how like it never ends, and like it really like makes a continuous like mark in like all these like individual like lives. And it was like so interesting to get a glimpse of that. And like also in this interview, yeah, like it like really means so much to me to like find out that it really impacted not only this institution. Like I'm like the living sort of like example of like how your efforts have like translated into like institutional transformation, like yeah, but also it also impacted like all of like your lives too, in a way that like yeah, like you learned the language, you learned like the activist method, and you were also able to get a PhD in the process. So wow. Okay. Yeah. Definitely somehow, but yeah, you did it. It's
Yeah, this is great. I remember I came to Columbia a couple of years ago to give a talk in the English department. I think it was the English department graduate group or something that invited me. And Dr. Sandler, Matt, was there, and I talked a little bit about the ethnic studies protests in my talk. And during the Q&A, he said something like, well, I teach in, like the center now. So I just wanted to thank you for like making me a job.
Yeah, hiring me,
Yeah,
giving
exactly.
me wages. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Right. Yeah, but like that's also, I mean, we didn't know. I didn't like I really didn't we wouldn't I couldn't have predicted at the end of the protests themselves that
Mhm.
even the center would be created, you know. And so
Mhm.
I think that that has to do with the way that the energy of the protests and that the work that was mobilized in the protests continued, you know. And I wasn't, as an undergraduate, I was not one of the people doing that, but clearly, you know, the university might have thought that they shut down this protest,
Mhm.
but the work carried on, and it's
Absolutely.
that sustained work that actually creates, you know, centers and hires.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And like yeah, that actually leads like is perfectly to my next question of like so you were like you weren't there to like actually experience the sort of like achievements or like the legacy of like I would say like directly of the hunger like strikes and like 1996 protests. So like how so like did you like when was it when you like first became aware like you were a sophomore so like when you were a senior did you hear from the university at all or like after graduation like how long did it take for you to perceive the changes?
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, I it Columbia kind of fell off my radar in terms of like
Very
development in
understandable.
the university. Yeah, so I think that at some point, you know, when I was in grad school, you know, I would occasionally be like, did they ever hire those like
Those
people
people.
hire at Columbia? But I really didn't follow up on it. And so it was not until I started meeting people like Matt Sandler, who are actually teaching in the center, that I was like, oh, they really created this thing, you know, like it actually, they made something.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, it was very, very belated for me. I did when came back. So I spent my junior year abroad in the
Mhm.
Oxford exchange program.
Oh, okay. Mhm.
I was away for all of 96, 97. And then I came back for my senior year. And I came back, I mean, it was partially having been in England for a year where I was like, you know, which I loved, but also like England was like Oxford was such a trip and it was super weird. And I
I girl, I have friends in Oxford right now, and I feel you. Without any explanation needed, I'm like right there.
yeah, yeah, like I was enough of a British lit nerd that like I was like soaking it up. But also if I thought that Columbia was like a white supremacist, you know, like cage, like Oxford England was something like a whole new level
Yeah, it's like an
of
underwater sea cave of
exactly. So when I came back, I think I was so relieved to be back in New York in some ways, and to be back in you know, back in communities of color.
color.
um and I took very different courses my senior year. All again, all English courses because I was still an English nerd,
Uh-huh,
but
uh-huh.
I took very different courses my senior year than I did before I went. So I took David Eng taught in the
Mhm.
English department at Columbia at that
Uh-huh.
time. So I took Asian American Lit with David. Um, I took African American Lit with Anne, what's her last name? I think she still teaches there. I'm just blanking on her name. Anyway, um, a white woman who specializes in
Uh-huh.
African American Lit,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
you know, recognized as an expert. And it was an eye-opening class. It was amazing.
Mhm.
Um, I took a course in post-colonial thought and theory. Um, so anyway, I think that I came back and had a much different understanding of like
Mhm.
what studying literature could look like,
Mhm.
um, than I had when I, you know, started as an English major at Columbia, and that was significant for me.
Mhm.
So yeah, more than kind of keeping up with the institutional developments, I
Mhm.
think that I absorbed, you know, I absorbed the the learnings of the protest, and kind of carried them through in the way that I understood my own, uh, like my own scholarly work and the
Absolutely.
possibilities of
Absolutely.
scholarly work.
Yeah, yeah. And but they were still offered under like the English or like
Oh yeah, it was all
comparative
the English
literature
department.
department. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, but it's yeah. I would say like it's weirdly relatable because I came here thinking I was going to be like a sociology major, wonder like whatever that is right now. I have no idea, but I was taking like, art literature humanities, and like I took like okay, like as a global core, I don't know what I'll take. So I might take like intro to comparative ethnic studies taught
Mhm.
by like the department head Deborah Paredes now. And then yeah, I remember like okay, okay, and then like at the like last class I was like tearing up. I was like no, like there's no way. I'm like, I want to retake like 7 times this class, like for the rest of my year. And then, yeah, and then it really changed like my whole direction of like classes. I was like, yeah, I was like searching for like departments, like links that I have never even considered. And then it really changed, yeah, yeah, whatever. So completely like relatable when like, one experience or like one like yeah one like 1 year you're just like yep, just gonna search for different classes on like culpa. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, exactly. It's yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I teach now in, so at McMaster, the department I'm in is actually English and cultural studies. And so
Mhm,
I've been here since 2009.
mhm,
Um and the addition of cultural studies to the English department is something that happened before I was hired here, but
mhm.
not that long ago. So, like in institutional memory, only within the last 15 years.
Mhm.
Um, and that's actually like my understanding of ethnic studies and the importance of being part of a demand that ethnic studies concerns and methods be recognized,
Mhm.
within the university as an important site of internal critique, right? Like an
Oh,
important site
absolutely,
of
absolutely.
thinking critically about the institution from within the institution.
Mhm.
um, that really informs how I understand the cultural studies component of the department. And we offer, it's interesting, like the distinction between, or the relationship between the English and the cultural studies in my department is a little bit amorphous. But we do offer separate MAs in English and in what we call CSCT, or Cultural Studies and Critical Theory.
Uh-huh,
So they're
uh-huh.
different programs. And
Absolutely.
I teach one of the core seminars for our CSCT MA program. Um, and and yeah, like it's not, CSCT is not synonymous with ethnic studies by any means, but it definitely is a place in our department and in our university where the methods and theories that inform ethnic studies are also, kind of at the center, or considered foundational. And yeah, so even though we don't have an ethnic studies program at Mac, I'm hopeful that we will continue to develop programming along those lines, because I've been able to carry through, what I know in that area
Mhm.
in the form of cultural studies and critical theory. um but there's like a long way to go.
Well, we all do. We all do. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, but it's yeah, because I feel that like just as it happens for like Colombia, it comes with like little tweaks in like the curriculum that like individual professors or like even TAs like put in. And
Yeah,
then, it becomes, like two courses offered, and then like it becomes a couple of courses, and then now students are thinking like, oh, if we have all these courses, like why don't we have like a center department, and then like it goes from there. So yeah, like we still have like definitely a long way to go, but
mhm.
I definitely feel like just like having that mindset is really important to like just like get your eye on the final goal. Yeah,
Absolutely,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So like this is my sort of like last to like closing question, I guess. But like, just like looking back, and now you're at, a period where you're not like you've done your, you've done your share, like as a Columbia sort of like undergrad, I guess. Like you were involved in these protests. You didn't weren't aware of the exact like legacy of it like afterwards, but now, like you're sort of like looking back and like putting that into perspective, putting your, 19-year-old self into perspective, like 18-year-old self actually into perspective, like, what do you feel like? Do you think, you should have, like, what do you, like, reflecting, like, do you think you should have, done something differently? Would you, do it again? Like, what else do you think that, you feel about your like past experience?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I just I
Mhm.
feel all the time like I wish I could go do my undergraduate education all over again. Not because I feel like I did it wrong, but because I
Uh-huh.
feel like, and this is just true of education in general, that it's only at the end that you really figure out how to do it at all.
Oh, me, senior spring, me, yes.
It's like, yeah, like if you could be a freshman knowing what you know as a senior, just imagine like
Imagine all the things that I could do. Yes.
and so yeah, and so I feel a really intense version of that, which is like if I could be an undergraduate knowing what I know as a professor,
Mhm.
like I could just soak up so much more than I feel like I did. But obviously, like you soak up as much as you can at a time.
Absolutely.
So, I think I probably did all right. But I just miss it. I miss being a student. I really loved being a student, and uh, I loved the parts of it that felt like, even the parts of it when I felt at odds with, the university or the world I was in. In retrospect, I'm able to appreciate how that was all part of like the energy of
Absolutely.
that time. I just adored it. And
Yeah.
it's part of why I stayed in academia, like
Yeah.
it wasn't for academia itself. It wasn't for the institution,
Uh-huh,
because I've
uh-huh.
continued to like bang my
Yeah,
head
no,
against the
absolutely,
institution,
absolutely. Yeah.
but it's the energy of students and people who come together to learn, in this really intense collective and collaborative way. It's really wonderful. And yeah, I think that I experienced that in the ethnic studies protests for the first time in a way that I'd never felt in a classroom. And I loved classrooms and I loved seminar tables, but it was like the energy of a good class, like times 100, when you were in a crowd of like inspired protesters.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Just like, and like especially in this like pandemic era, just like the physicality of it, just like, yeah, it brings so many, just to see pictures of it, it just brings back so many things. And like, yeah, it really does. And
Yeah.
and yeah, I just wanna, yeah, like thank you because like just like you were like literally like the reason like why I'm like I like just like you know just to like return back to like introductions. I'm like an international student. I
Mhm.
come from like South Korea. I was not like I hadn't been to the US until college. I
Mm.
like came in as like a South Korean, student who like knew English, like knew how to speak English, but like literally that was the only thing I knew. Like, like I was like suddenly like, someone dropped like the Iliad copy in my hands and I was like, oh, I've never read more than like 500 pages or like, speaking this nonsense to me. And then, yeah, yeah, that was the beginning. And then, yeah. And, just like learning about like activism, learning about protest, learning about like so much from this, this program, this center has like taught me so many things. And right now I'm actually in the senior thesis seminar,
Mhm.
and we have like a community of like thesis students who are like writing thesis, like amazing theses. I'm like just like tearing up just talking about theses for this major. And I feel, and I exactly connect with you when you say like that community. It's not even the academia, it's not, definitely not the institution and the administration, but it's the community that like really gives you that energy and like pushes you forward, because I really find myself like in it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it just like inspires you every like second of your academic pursuits, like your all-nighters, your like, yeah, your like crazy Zoom study sessions,
Yeah.
which has become a thing now.
I know. I'm so glad that you found that. It's so important. And I'm sorry that you're all like separated from one another right now and you have to do it by Zoom, but I'm so glad that you found that. Yeah, I think that that's the most important thing to find as a
Absolutely.
student.
I just like, and I really feel that like I found it, and I feel like even this project is just like giving back in a
Mhm.
way to like the kind of community that I never thought I would be able to find in this foreign New York City like land. And this has really become like that home. Yeah, so it's like all like, my own sort of like birthday celebration that I'm giving to Caesar.
That's
Yeah.
so wonderful. I love it.
Mm.
So you're graduating this year?
Yes,
Do you
yes.
know what you're doing afterwards?
No, I have
Okay.
no idea. I have no idea. But so like because of the pandemic, they sort of like the Columbia sort of like cut the 2 semesters into 3 semesters, and then
Mhm.
they're offering like summer like semester for like free in a way for like the two tuition thing. So I'm like, yeah, like if they're not gonna, like charge me for it, I might as well take some
Totally.
classes.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Give
yeah, absolutely. So like my graduation isn't coming till like, my graduation is like in May, but I'm not actually going to be out of like student status until I think end of August, when like summer semester ends. But
Okay.
yeah, I'll be taking summer classes, like trying to figure out, what I'm going to do. But yeah, it's like it looks like I'm definitely going to apply to like grad schools, like, for the coming like next year,
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah, but
Great.
it it all looks like but I'm definitely gonna stay on like the Asian American studies, like nonprofit activism track,
Mhm.
hopefully in a way that is sustainable to providing rent in somewhere near New York City. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no idea how that's gonna work that out, but yeah, that's my goal. And
Sounds
yeah.
good. I mean, if you feel free to stay in touch, and if there's ever an opportunity when I could help with networking or putting you in touch with people, and also my mom has contacts if you wanted to stay in New York.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, so as things unfold,
Unfold.
you've got my email. Feel free to use it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, this means so much. I mean, yeah, you're talking to a confused, no idea university senior, just like, on her way to her senior thesis that I have like so little time to complete.
Yeah.
But but I will pull through. And this is my like closing, like last question that I like wrote down in my interview sheet. But like,
Yep.
you know, we know that you were all sort of like one of the main like goals was to set up a department. And what for the race and ethnic studies at Columbia, we still haven't got there. And yeah, like I feel that like my project will at least like be some kind of like foundational sort of like jumping, not even a jumping off point, but like just like a small speckle in that sort of like process where you're sort of like celebrating the demands that are still not being met but have like processed over time. So, in your way of just like communicating to like, people like me, or like even for the larger like Caesar student undergrad slash faculty slash graduate community, like, what actions, or like what do you expect from us, like what kind of message would you want to like get through to, considering like, your goals in 1996, or what changed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a big question.
I know that's a
It's a big
lot,
one.
but yeah.
It's a big one. I think so. Two different things are coming to my mind that might actually not be two different things. They might be two sides of the same thing.
Mhm,
I mean, the first is the material aspect of the original ask for
mhm,
a department.
mhm,
And so this is kind of pragmatic, like a pragmatic message, which is to encourage people to continue to learn and think critically about the the kinds of structures that a university is capable of creating,
mhm.
and what those structures enable people to do. And I'm not certain that departments are always going to be like, I'm not sure that a department is the same thing now than it
Right,
was then.
right.
um so I wouldn't say like department or die,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because departments, but what the department meant at the time,
Right.
that is still important. And what it was a, a recognized body
Mhm.
with a dedicated set of resources, right? So a revenue stream that
Right,
was guaranteed because it was a specific, department within a college, um, with like
faculty.
permanent faculty that were not just volunteering from
Right,
another department,
right, right.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because one of the things that universities have continued to rely, I mean, it all comes together. This is all related to the reasons that we were trying to unionize as graduate students. Um, since the time I was at Columbia, universities have more and more tried to extract they try to extract more labor out of people without compensating them for it, right? So every innovation that every university has made over the past few decades has happened in conjunction with this atrophying of robust permanent faculty positions.
Right.
So on the one hand, universities look like they're doing a whole lot. They're creating new centers, they're creating new institutes, they
Right.
have this program and that program. But when you put that together with the withering of permanent faculty lines, increased workloads for adjuncts,
Uh,
increased workloads for PhD students and graduate students, what you see is people, I mean, this is how I read it, excellent programs like programs for the study of race and ethnicity, um, they are being held together because the people who give their labor and time to them do it as a labor of love,
right. It's just
right?
like goodwill thing with like so many passionate people who are like willing to like sacrifice, everything for, like just for the sake of like teaching the students. Yeah, I feel
Yes,
that every day.
because we recognize how important it is, right? And so like if the university says to you, look, you can do this, but like you've got to do it on these terms, they have a whole, they know that more of us are going to say yes than no. um, and I think that universities have actually systematized this system of exploitation, right? They've come to understand that people are willing
To do
to go the extra mile, right, in an uncompensated way in order to hold these things up, because we're terrified of losing the small gains that we've made.
that.
So I actually think it's incredibly important that we recognize the unsustainability of that mode of providing this kind of education, and refuse the institutional logic that this is the only way it's going to happen. You know, it's like this or nothing. And that ask of a department, that ask of permanent faculty positions, that ask of dedicated revenue streams, those remain really, really crucial, because what we're asking for is posterity, right? Like, we want these programs not just to kind of like exist on the fly, but we need them to be sites where the community, the intellectual community, can reproduce itself.
Yes. 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 Yeah.
So that's, yeah, I think that's, well, so this is two sides of the same thing, because the other thing I was going to say is, and this is maybe the more hopeful side of it,
Mhm.
is just what you said about the community being, you know, like being the crucial thing, that these institutional asks were absolutely about, you know, asking for academic resources, asking for space to pursue academic interests.
Right.
But they were always also
Mhm.
requests for, you know, the university to create conditions in which a community can form.
Yes.
And that community is so important. And I've been thinking more and more myself recently, as I've become, you know, ambivalently hopeful about the future of the university in
Mhm.
general, as a colonial institution.
Mhm.
At some point, I do think it's worth asking ourselves if the university is the only place that we can imagine this community, you
Mhm.
know, like forming itself.
Mhm.
Because ethnic studies is special in that it has always existed both in and out of the university at the same time, right? It has always insisted on its deep roots and relationships with non-academic community, right? Which is why they closed the gates on 116th Street, right? To like
That's
sever that
exactly
connection.
what. Yep. Yep.
And so at some point, you know, if the university refuses to become a place that really properly houses and shelters and nourishes these kinds of intellectual efforts, where else might we do that? You know, where else might we take it? Because the colonial university doesn't have a, you know, it likes to think it has a monopoly on intellectual work, but it never has, right?
Never has.
So yeah, those are the two things that I think I would leave you with.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It makes perfect sense. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. It really is like, yeah, it really is, you know, asking for something like pragmatic to the institution itself, but also like reimagining something that, you know, yeah, that just doesn't need to stay within like the boundaries of like an institution that's like basically driven by profit and or like white supremacist ideas. And yeah, it's like also I think like questioning ourselves, because like, you know, we all always think that our education or everything is just like bound to like the institution or like the diploma or the degree, but you know, it's not about that at all. Like university is basically just like that small Morningside campus and like a couple of links on courseworks, and then everything else is like outside. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, definitely.
exactly.
Exactly. I cannot like I cannot like express like how glad I am, just like not even for the project, like this talk is like so good. Like this is the best thing that's happened to me in like 2021 and perhaps 2020. Absolutely. And like thank you so much for like having this really long but like so fruitful like conversation. I really think that like this is going to like really change like all the things, like really the project. I'm like so excited, and
I
thank
am
you.
excited too. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk. Like, this has really been wonderful for me. I haven't put this all together in a very long time, so it's exciting for
I
me
know.
too. And
Yeah.
I'm excited about your project. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it all comes together. So
Absolutely, absolutely. I will definitely be, you know, yeah, like giving you yeah, like materials, like things to look at and stuff like that. And I will definitely, hopefully keep in contact among the whole craziness of being a senior in a pandemic. Yeah, thank you so much. And
You're very
yeah,
welcome.
like, and you're right now in in
In Hamilton,
yeah.
in Canada. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I guess the timeline isn't too different. Yeah.
No, no, it's I'm still in the, I'm still on New York time. I'm always like
Oh,
internally
New
on
York
New
Times.
York time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, so it was really great talking to you, and have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Thank you for sacrificing like 2 hours on a Sunday for me. Yeah, I
Really my
will.
pleasure.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
stay safe, stay
Stay safe.
warm and well.
You too. You too. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.